Miss Marple's Hidden Nook. The corner concealed a deadly truth. Chapter 1. The Nook's quiet, welcome Miss Jane Marple stepped off the creaking bus onto the cobbled lane of St. Mary's Hollow, her sensible shoes tapping lightly against the stones. The village, nestled in a fold of the English countryside, was as picturesque as a postcard, with its thatched cottages and rose-laden fences. Yet, as the autumn breeze stirred the leaves, Miss Marple felt a faint prick of unease, as if the village were holding its breath. She adjusted her hat and glanced at the letter in her gloved hand. It was an invitation from Mrs. Clara Henshaw, proprietress of the Hidden Nook, a guest house recommended by her nephew Raymond. "A quiet retreat, Aunt Jane," he had said. "Just the place for you to knit and enjoy some peace." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Peace, she knew from experience, was often a veneer for something far more interesting. The Hidden Nook stood at the edge of the village, a rambling Tudor-style house with ivy clinging to its walls and mullioned windows glinting in the late afternoon sun. As Miss Marple approached, the front door opened, revealing a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a practised smile. "Miss Marple, I'm Clara Henshaw. Welcome to the Hidden Nook." Her voice was warm, but her glance darted past Miss Marple, as if checking the empty lane. "Thank you, Mrs. Henshaw," Miss Marple replied, her own eyes taking in the polished brass knocker and the slightly worn doormat. What a charming place. Inside, the guest house was a study in cosy elegance. Polished oak beams, a crackling fire in the parlour, and the faint scent of lavender polish. Yet, as Mrs. Henshaw led her to the reception desk, Miss Marple noticed a door at the end of the hall, its heavy bolt gleaming new against the aged wood. "Storage, I presume?" she asked lightly. Mrs. Henshaw's smile tightened. "Oh, yes, just old linens and such. No need for guests to bother with it." Her tone was brisk, and she quickly turned to a ledger, assigning Miss Marple a room on the second floor. The parlour was occupied by a handful of guests, introduced over a pot of Earl Grey. There was Mr. Reginald Poole, a retired colonel with a bristling moustache and a penchant for military anecdotes; Miss Eleanor Vance, a young artist with paint-stained fingers and a nervous laugh; and Mrs. Lavinia Gray, a widow draped in black crape, whose eyes seemed to see more than she said. As they chatted, Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, her ears attuned to the undertones in their voices. It was Miss Vance who first mentioned the local legend. "They say this house has a hidden corner," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A place no one talks about. Something happened there years ago." "Nonsense," Colonel Poole huffed, stirring his tea. "Old houses always have stories. Probably just a draughty cupboard." Mrs. Gray's teacup rattled faintly in its saucer. "Some stories are true," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the fire. Mrs. Henshaw entered at that moment, her apron crisp and her smile firmly in place. "More scones, anyone?" she asked, and the conversation shifted to the weather. But Miss Marple noted the way Mrs. Henshaw's eyes lingered on Mrs. Gray, and how the maid, a mousy girl named Lily, nearly dropped a plate when the hidden corner was mentioned. As Miss Marple retired to her room that evening, she paused at the bolted door in the hall. The house was silent, save for the creak of floorboards and the distant tick of a clock. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where every village secret had a way of unravelling, and of the many hidden corners she had uncovered in her time, this one, she suspected, concealed more than dust and linens. With a final glance at the bolted door, Miss Marple climbed the stairs, her mind already weaving the threads of St. Mary's Hollow into a pattern that promised to be anything but peaceful. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Wallpaper. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlour of the hidden nook the following morning, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the room with her usual unobtrusive sharpness. The sunlight streamed through the mullioned windows, casting dappled patterns across the walls, which were adorned with faded wallpaper in a curious design of ivy and roses. To the untrained eye, it was merely decorative, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the pattern. There was something about the way the vines twisted, almost as if they formed a deliberate shape. A map, perhaps, or a code hidden in plain sight. She had risen early, as was her habit, and taken a turn about the guest-house's garden before breakfast. The air had been crisp, the roses heavy with dew, but her attention had been drawn to the high hedge maze at the garden's edge, its paths vanishing into shadow. The gardener, an old man with gnarled hands, had nodded to her, but offered no conversation. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with him later. Gardeners, she knew, often saw more than they let on. Now, in the parlour, the other guests were gathering for breakfast. Colonel Reginald Poole was already seated, buttering toast with military precision and regaling Miss Eleanor Vance with a tale of his days in India. The young artist listened politely, though her eyes darted nervously to the door each time it opened. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, the widow, sat apart, her black crepe dress absorbing the light as she sipped her tea in silence. Mrs. Clara Henshaw bustled, in with a tray of scones, her smile as polished as the silver teapot. "Lovely wallpaper, isn't it?" Miss Marple remarked casually, her needles pausing as she addressed Mrs. Henshaw. Such an intricate design, almost as if it's telling a story. Mrs. Henshaw's hand faltered briefly as she set down the tray. "Oh, it's just old-fashioned." "Nonsense," she said with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The house dates back to the 18th century, you know. The original owners had a fondness for such things." "Fascinating," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze returning to the wallpaper. She noted a particular swirl where the ivy seemed to converge, forming what might be a corner or a doorway. It was the sort of detail that most would overlook, but Miss Marple had long ago learned that secrets often hid in the mundane. The conversation turned to the history of the hidden nook, prompted by Miss Vance's timid question about the house's origins. I heard it was built by a wealthy merchant," she said, her fingers twisting a napkin. "But someone at the village shop mentioned, well, a tragedy." Colonel Poole snorted, crumbs falling from his moustache. "Village gossip. Every old house has a ghost story. Probably some servant tripped down the stairs a century ago." Mrs. Gray set her teacup down with a sharp clink. "Not a servant," she said softly, her voice cutting through the room. "A young woman, a guest like us. She vanished, and they say it happened in the hidden corner." The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her eyes missed nothing. The way Miss Vance's hands trembled, the sudden stiffness in Mrs. Henshaw's posture, and the flicker of unease in Colonel Poole's bluff demeanour. "Vanished?" Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. "How curious. And this hidden corner, is it part of the house?" Mrs. Henshaw recovered quickly, her smile returning like a curtain drawn across a stage. "Just a silly legend, Miss Marple. The house has its quirks, but there's no corner that's hidden. More tea?" Miss Vance, however, seemed unable to let the subject drop. "The shopkeeper said it was upstairs, near the attic. A place no one goes." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she glanced at Mrs. Henshaw as if expecting a reprimand. "Nonsense," the Colonel interjected again, though his bluster seemed less certain. "Old houses creak and groan, and people invent stories to explain them." Mrs. Gray's eyes met Miss Marple's for a fleeting moment, and in them Miss Marple saw a shadow of knowledge, or perhaps fear. "Some stories," the widow said, "are more than invention." As breakfast concluded, Miss Marple excused herself to examine the hall. The bolted door she had noticed the previous evening was still there, its lock gleaming in the morning light. She paused, her fingers brushing the wood, and thought of the wallpaper's strange pattern and Mrs. Gray's cryptic words. In St. Mary Mead, she had known many houses with secrets, and the hidden nook, she was certain, was no exception. Returning to the parlour, she caught sight of Lily, the maid, polishing a mirror with excessive vigour. The girl's eyes darted to the bolted door, then away, as if it held a secret she dared not share. Miss Marple smiled to herself. The wallpaper, the door, the whispered legend, they were all threads in a tapestry, and she was already beginning to see the shape of the pattern. Chapter 3. The Locked Attic Door. Miss Jane Marple stood at the end of the upstairs corridor of the hidden nook, her eyes fixed on the heavy oak door that had caught her attention since her arrival. It was an unassuming thing, tucked beneath a low lintel, but the bolt securing it was incongruously modern, its brass gleaming against the weathered wood. In the dim light of the sconce, the door seemed to pulse with a quiet defiance, as if daring her to inquire further. Miss Marple, never one to resist such a challenge, adjusted her shawl and considered her next move. The morning had been uneventful, save for the lingering unease from breakfast. The whispered talk of a hidden corner and a vanished woman had left a mark on the guests, though they masked it with polite chatter over Mrs. Henshaw's excellent marmalade. Miss Marple had spent the hours since then exploring the guest-house's public rooms, her knitting bag in hand, her mind cataloguing every detail. The creak of a particular floorboard, the faint draught near the parlour window, and the way Lily, the maid, avoided the upstairs corridor altogether. Now, as the afternoon light filtered through a nearby window, Miss Marple traced her fingers along the door-frame, noting the faint scratches near the bolt, as if it had been hastily installed. She glanced down the corridor, ensuring she was alone, and gave the handle a gentle tug. It didn't budge, but the faint rattle suggested the lock was more for show than substance. "Curious," she murmured, her mind drifting to the vicarage in St. Mary Mead, where a locked cupboard had once concealed a rather scandalous secret. Footsteps approached, and Miss Marple stepped back, assuming an air of innocent curiosity, as Mrs. Clara Henshaw appeared at the top of the stairs. The proprietress's smile was as crisp as her apron, but her eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of Miss Marple near the door. "Lost, Miss Marple?" she asked, her tone light but edged with something sharper. "Oh, not at all," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft and disarming. "I was just admiring the craftsmanship of these old doors. This one seems, well, rather secure for an attic, don't you think?" Mrs. Henshaw's laugh was a touch too bright. "Just storage, as I said. Old houses like this collect all sorts of clutter. Broken furniture, moth-eaten curtains. No need to bother with it." She moved to usher Miss Marple toward the stairs, but her hand lingered on the banister, as if anchoring herself. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling with mild amusement, "though in my village attics often hold the most fascinating stories. Old letters, family secrets, even the occasional mystery." Mrs. Henshaw's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "No mysteries here, I'm afraid. Just dust. Shall we join the others for tea?" Miss Marple allowed herself to be led downstairs, but not before casting a final glance at the door. Its presence gnawed at her, much like the loose thread in a poorly knitted scarf. At tea, the parlour was a scene of forced cheer. Colonel Reginald Poole was expounding on the virtues of discipline, his voice booming over the clink of teacups. Miss Eleanor Vance, the young artist, sketched absently on a napkin, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting something, or someone. Mrs. Lavinia Gray sat in her usual corner, her black crepe dress blending into the shadows, her silence louder than the Colonel's bluster. It was Lily the maid who provided the next thread in Miss Marple's tapestry. As she cleared the tea tray, the girl's hands trembled, and a saucer slipped, clattering to the floor. "Oh, I'm sorry," she gasped, kneeling to gather the pieces. "No harm done, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, bending to help. As their hands brushed, she noticed Lily's gaze flicker toward the staircase, toward the corridor with the locked door. "You seem a bit nervous, Lily," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle. "Is something troubling you?" Lily's cheeks flushed, and she shook her head vigorously. "No, ma'am, just clumsy, that's all." But her eyes betrayed her, wide and fleeting, as if the attic door loomed in her mind. Miss Marple said nothing more. But later, as she strolled through the village to clear her thoughts, she stopped at the local post office, where gossip flowed as freely as tea in St. Mary Mead. The postmistress, a stout woman with a penchant for storytelling, was happy to oblige. "The Hidden Nook? Oh, it's a lovely place, but there's talk," she said, leaning over the counter. "Years ago, a young woman stayed there, a guest like yourself. She went missing, and some say it happened up in the attic. They locked it after that, and no one's been up there since." "Missing?" Miss Marple repeated, her expression one of polite surprise. "How dreadful! Was she ever found?" The postmistress shook her head. "Not a trace. Some say she ran off. Others, well, they say the hidden corner took her. Silly, of course, but folk round here love a tale." Miss Marple thanked her and returned to the Hidden Nook, her mind turning over the story. A missing woman, a locked attic, a nervous maid, and that curious wallpaper with its twisting vines. She felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to form, though the picture was still obscured. That evening, as she sat in her room, knitting by the light of a single lamp, she thought of the attic door and the scratches on its frame. In her experience, locks were rarely about keeping things out. More often, They were about keeping something in. As the house settled into silence, Miss Marple heard a faint creak from the corridor, followed by the soft thud of a door, perhaps the very one she had examined. She paused, her needle still, and listened. The hidden nook, she was certain, was whispering its secrets, and she intended to hear every word. Chapter 4. Shadows at Tea Time. The parlour of the hidden nook was bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, the kind of light that softened edges and lent an air of tranquillity to even the most troubled gatherings. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual armchair, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her eyes were far from idle. The tea-tray before her was laden with delicate china cups, a steaming pot, and a plate of sconinci, but the atmosphere was anything but cosy. The guests assembled for Mrs. Henshaw's daily ritual of afternoon tea seemed to carry their own shadows, each casting a subtle pall over the room. Colonel Reginald Poole was holding court, as was his wont, his voice booming as he recounted a tale of a tiger hunt in Bengal. Miss Eleanor Vance, the young artist, sat across from him, her fingers nervously twisting a teaspoon, her eyes flitting to the door as if expecting an unwelcome arrival. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, the widow, occupied her customary corner, her black crepe dress absorbing the light, her silence a stark contrast to the Colonel's bluster. Mrs. Clara Henshaw, ever the attentive hostess, poured tea with a practised smile, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her hand as she passed a cup to Miss Vance. It was Miss Vance who disrupted the fragile calm. As she reached for her tea, her hand jerked and the cup tipped, sending a stream of amber liquid onto the Persian rug beneath the table. "Oh, how clumsy of me!" she exclaimed, her voice high and brittle as she scrambled to blot the spill with her napkin. "No matter, dear," Mrs. Henshaw said quickly, kneeling to assist. But as she lifted the edge of the rug to dab at the stain, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a glimpse of something else. A darker, rust-coloured mark, irregular and faded, that no amount of scrubbing could fully conceal. It was the sort of stain, Miss Marple thought, that might once have been blood. "Goodness," she said mildly, her needles pausing. "That's an unusual mark. An old spill, perhaps?" Mrs. Henshaw's head snapped up, her smile tightening. "Oh, just some wine from years ago," she said, her tone dismissive. "These old rugs hold on to everything. Lily, fetch a cloth, please." The maid, Lily, appeared from the doorway, her face pale as she hurried to obey. Miss Marple noted the girl's quick glance at the rug, and the way her hands shook as she handed Mrs. Henshaw a damp cloth. The incident was smoothed over with the efficiency of a seasoned hostess. But the air in the parlour had shifted, as if the stain had whispered a secret none wished to acknowledge. Determined to draw out the guests, Miss Marple turned the conversation to their reasons for staying at the hidden nook. "Such a charming retreat," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "What brought you all here, I wonder? A holiday, perhaps? Or something more personal?" Colonel Poole puffed out his chest. "Needed a bit of quiet after the hustle of London," he said. "This place has history, you know. Suits a man who appreciates tradition." His words were hearty, but Miss Marple caught the way his eyes flicked to Mrs. Henshaw, as if seeking confirmation. Miss Vance, still flushed from her mishap, spoke hesitantly. I came to sketch. The village is so picturesque, and I thought the house might inspire me. Though—" She trailed off, her fingers twisting the napkin again. "It's quieter than I expected." Mrs. Gray's voice, when it came, was low and deliberate. "I had business in the area," she said, her eyes fixed on her teacup. "Old ties, you might say. The hidden nook seemed convenient." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, but her mind was racing. In St. Mary Mead, she had known many such gatherings, where polite words masked deeper truths. The Colonel's bluster, Miss Vance's nerves, Mrs. Gray's cryptic brevity, each suggested a story untold. And that stain on the rug, so quickly dismissed, was not the sort of mark left by a careless glass of wine. She thought of the locked attic door, the whispers of a vanished woman, and the curious pattern in the wallpaper. Could the hidden corner be tied to a crime that left its mark on the very fabric of the house? As tea concluded, Miss Marple lingered, offering to help Lily clear the cups. The maid hesitated, then accepted, and as they worked, Miss Marple spoke softly. "That rug must be difficult to clean," she said. "Such an old stain. Do you know how it came to be there?" Lily's eyes widened, and she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know, ma'am. It's always been there since I started working here. Mrs. Henshaw says it's nothing, but her glance toward the rug betrayed her, and Miss Marple saw fear in her eyes, as if the stain were a ghost that haunted her. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her room, knitting by the light of the lamp, she reflected on the day's discoveries. The stain, the locked door, the nervous maid. They were pieces of a puzzle, and she suspected that one of the guests, or perhaps Mrs. Henshaw herself, knew more than they let on. In her experience, bloodstains, like secrets, had a way of resurfacing, and the hidden nook was proving to be a house full of both. Chapter 5. The gardener's tale. The morning mist hung low over the gardens of the hidden nook, curling around the rose bushes and softening the outlines of the high hedge maze that dominated the grounds. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her woolen shawl, strolled along the gravel path, her sensible shoes crunching softly as she took in the scene. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and late-blooming lavender, but her attention was fixed on the maze, a labyrinth of dark green yew, its paths twisting into shadows that seemed to beckon and conceal in equal measure. In St. Mary Mead, she had known gardens to hold secrets as surely as houses, and she suspected this one was no exception. Her destination was the small potting shed at the garden's edge, where she had glimpsed the elderly gardener earlier that morning. He was there now, bent over a tray of seedlings, his gnarled hands moving with the slow deliberation of one who had tended the earth for decades. His name, she had learned from Lily, was Mr. Thomas Cobb, and he had worked at the hidden nook since before Mrs. Henshaw's time. Miss Marple, ever adept at coaxing stories from the reticent, approached with a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Cobb," she said, her voice warm and unassuming. "What a splendid garden! You must know every inch of it." The gardener looked up, his weathered face creasing into a cautious nod. "Aye, miss," he said, his voice rough as the bark he handled. "Been here nigh on 50 years. Seen the roses bloom and fade more times than I can count. Miss Marple settled onto a nearby bench, her knitting bag at her side, though she made no move to open it. 50 years is a long time, she said. This place must have stories to tell. The house, the garden, perhaps even that maze. Mr. Cobb's hands stilled, and his eyes, sharp beneath bushy brows, met hers for a moment before returning to his work. Stories, aye, he said. Old places like this collect 'em, same as dust. Not all worth telling. Oh, I don't. No, Miss Marple said lightly, her tone inviting confidences. In my village, the oldest stories are often the most fascinating. I've heard talk of a hidden corner here. Something about the original owners, perhaps? The gardener's fingers tightened around a trowel, and he paused, as if weighing his words. Folks talk too much, he said at last, his voice low. The hidden nook's got its name for a reason. Corners here ain't always what they seem. He gestured vaguely toward the maze, its entrance a dark archway in the mist. That there maze, for one, built by the first master of the house, Mr. Gideon Vale. Said he wanted a place to think, but some reckon he made it to hide something. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained placid. Hide something, she repeated. How intriguing. A treasure, perhaps, or something less pleasant? Mr. Cobb snorted, but there was no humour in it. No treasure, miss. Not the kind you're thinking. There was a girl, years back, a guest, like yourself. Came to stay, then vanished. Some said she got lost in the maze, but I reckon she found something she weren't meant to. A corner, maybe, where secrets get buried. The word buried hung in the air, heavy as the mist. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. Buried, Mr. Cobb? In the maze? He shrugged, his eyes fixed on the seedlings. Aye, don't go in there no more. Too many shadows. But I seen things, back when I was younger. Footprints where no one should have been. A spade gone missing, then found with dirt it shouldn't have had. And once... He hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. Once I heard a sound from the maze like a sob. Middle of the night it was. Never found nothing, but I ain't forgot it. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over his words like pieces of a quilt. The maze, with its twisting paths and hidden corners, was a new thread in the tapestry of the hidden nook's secrets. She thought of the locked attic door, the blood-like stain on the parlour rug, and the nervous glances of Lily and Miss Vance. Could the hidden corner be a place in the garden rather than the house? A spot where a crime had been concealed, perhaps literally beneath the earth? Thank you, Mr. Cobb, she said, rising from the bench. You've given me much to think about. I believe I'll take a closer look at that maze one of these days. The gardener grunted, his attention back on his seedlings. Mind your step, miss, he said. Some paths don't lead where you expect. As Miss Marple made her way back to the house, she paused at the maze's entrance, peering into its shadowed depths. The yew hedges were dense, their branches woven tight, and the air within seemed cooler, heavier. She made a mental note to explore it soon, perhaps when the other guests were occupied. For now, she returned to the parlour, where tea was being served, and resumed her knitting, her needles clicking as her mind wove together the gardener's tale with the whispers of the house. At tea, she watched the guests with renewed interest. Colonel Poole's anecdotes seemed louder today, as if drowning out some inner disquiet. Miss Vance's hands trembled as she sketched, her pencil tracing the outline of a maze-like pattern. Mrs. Gray, as ever, was silent, but her eyes lingered on the window overlooking the garden, where the maze loomed like a silent sentinel. Mrs. Henshaw, pouring tea, seemed oblivious, but Miss Marple noted the way her gaze darted to the garden door, as if expecting an uninvited guest. The hidden nook, Miss Marple thought, was a house of corners, some locked, some buried, some whispered about, in fear. And in one of those corners, she was certain, lay the truth that had haunted this place for decades. As she sipped her tea, she resolved to find it, whether it hid in the attic, the parlour, or the shadowed paths of the maze. Chapter 6. A Scream in the Night. The clock in the hall of the hidden nook had just struck 11 when a scream shattered, the stillness, sharp and piercing, echoing through the old house like a crack in a pane of glass. Miss Jane Marple, who had been reading by the light of her bedside lamp, set her book aside and sat upright, her senses alert. The scream had come from somewhere within the house, upstairs perhaps, or from the shadowed corridors that wound around the heart of the hidden nook. In St. Mary Mead, she had heard such sounds before, and they rarely heralded anything as simple as a nightmare. She rose, slipping on her dressing gown, and stepped into the corridor, her slippers silent on the polished floorboards. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of a sconce at the far end, near the locked attic door. As she paused, listening, she heard hurried footsteps and muffled voices below. Moving with her usual unobtrusive grace, Miss Marple descended the stairs, her eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. In the parlour, she found Mrs. Clara Henshaw, her hair in curlers and her face pale beneath a hastily donned shawl. Colonel Reginald Poole stood by the fireplace, his nightshirt tucked into trousers, a poker gripped in one hand as if ready to fend off an intruder. Miss Eleanor Vance hovered near the doorway, her nightgown clutched tightly, her eyes wide with fear. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, surprisingly composed, sat in her usual chair, her dark eyes watching the scene with an intensity that Miss Marple found intriguing. "What on earth was that?" the Colonel demanded, his moustache bristling. "Sounded like a banshee. Woke me from a dead sleep." Mrs. Henshaw wrung her hands, her voice unsteady. I'm sure it was nothing. Perhaps Lily dropped something in the kitchen. She's always up late cleaning." "Cleaning at this hour?" Miss Marple said mildly, her tone inviting explanation. "It sounded rather more human, don't you think?" Miss Vance let out a small whimper. "It came from upstairs," she said, her voice trembling. "Near my room, I think. I was just falling asleep when I heard it. It was awful, like someone in pain." "Nonsense," Colonel Poole said, though his grip on the poker tightened. "Probably a cat in the garden. These old houses carry sound in the strangest ways." Mrs. Gray's voice cut through the room, low and deliberate. "It was no cat," she said, "and it wasn't in the garden. It came from within the house." Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling, towards the corridor, where the locked attic door stood. Mrs. Henshaw's smile was strained. "Really, Mrs. Gray, there's no need to alarm everyone. I'll check on Lily and the house. I'm sure there's a simple explanation." She moved toward the kitchen, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands twisted in her shawl, as if anchoring her composure. Determined to gather more information, Miss Marple turned to Miss Vance. "You said it was near your room, dear. Could you show me where you heard it?" Miss Vance hesitated, then nodded, leading Miss Marple and the others upstairs. She pointed to a spot near her door, just a few paces from the locked attic door. "It was here," she said. "I'm certain. It sounded so close, like it was right on the other side of the wall." Miss Marple examined the corridor, her eyes lingering on the attic door. The bolt was still in place, undisturbed, but she noticed a faint scuff mark on the floor nearby, as if someone had stood there recently. "Curious," she murmured, her mind turning over the possibilities. A scream so close to the locked door suggested either someone inside the attic, a possibility Mrs. Henshaw had dismissed, or someone in the corridor, perhaps startled by what they found. Colonel Poole, who had followed them, scoffed. "Probably just the wind rattling that old door. I was in my room, dead asleep, until that racket woke me. Didn't see a thing." Mrs. Gray, who had joined them silently, offered no comment, but her gaze was fixed on the attic door, as if she could see through its heavy oak. Miss Marple made a mental note of her silence. In her experience, those who said the least often knew the most. When Mrs. Henshaw returned, she was accompanied by Lily, who looked more shaken than ever. "It wasn't me, ma'am," the maid said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was in the kitchen, washing up. I heard the scream, but I don't know where it came from." "Where were you exactly, Lily?" Miss Marple asked gently. "In the kitchen the whole time?" Lily nodded, but her eyes darted to Mrs. Henshaw, as if seeking approval. "Yes, ma'am, I was at the sink. I didn't see nothing." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was busy. Lily's alibi was too quick, too rehearsed, and Mrs. Henshaw's insistence that the scream was nothing rang hollow. The Colonel's bluster seemed to mask unease. Miss Vance's fear was genuine but vague, and Mrs. Gray's cryptic certainty suggested she knew more than she let on. The scream, Miss Marple thought, could have been a cry of discovery, someone stumbling upon the hidden corner, or its secrets, or an attempt to silence a witness to the truth. As the guests returned to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered in the corridor, her fingers brushing the attic door's bolt. The scuff mark, the scream, the locked door. They were threads in a pattern, and she suspected they wove together to form the deadly truth that haunted the hidden nook. St. Mary Mead, screams in the night had often led to revelations, and she was determined to uncover what this one concealed. Back in her room, she sat by the window, her knitting untouched, and listened to the house settle into an uneasy silence. The maze outside loomed in the moonlight, its shadows as impenetrable as the secrets within the house. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would explore further. Perhaps the maze, perhaps the attic, perhaps the alibis that didn't quite align. For now, she closed her eyes, letting the night's events settle into the tapestry of her mind, where the truth was beginning to take shape. Chapter 7. The Dusty Ledger. The library of the hidden nook was a small, dimly lit room tucked at the back of the house, its shelves sagging under the weight of leather-bound volumes and forgotten novels. Miss Jane Marple, seeking a quiet corner after the unsettling events of the previous night, had wandered in with her knitting bag, her eyes bright with curiosity. The air smelled of old paper and wax polish, and the morning light filtered through, a single window illuminating motes of dust that danced like secrets in the stillness. In St. Mary Mead, she had often found that libraries held more than books, and she suspected the hidden nooks would be no exception. She settled into a worn armchair, her needles clicking softly as she surveyed the room. The shelves were cluttered with an eclectic mix: gardening manuals, Gothic romances, and a few ledgers that looked out of place among the literature. It was one of these ledgers, bound in cracked leather and tucked behind a row of dusty tomes, that caught her attention. Its spine was faded, but the embossed initials, G.V., presumably Gideon Vale, the house's original owner, stood out in gold. Miss Marple, never one to ignore a promising thread, reached for it, brushing away a cobweb as she did. The ledger was heavy, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with meticulous entries in a spidery hand, dates from decades past recorded expenses and income. But as Miss Marple turned the pages, her sharp eyes noted irregularities. Large sums paid to unnamed recipients, labelled only as C or L, and cryptic notes like "settled for silence" and "corner account." The figures were substantial, far beyond the costs of running a household, and the dates clustered around the time the postmistress had mentioned: a young woman's disappearance some 30 years ago. Curious, Miss Marple murmured, her fingers tracing a line that read, "To C for the corner, $500. In her experience, such sums were rarely innocent. They spoke of blackmail, debts, or a cover-up. Could the corner refer to the hidden corner of village law? And was it tied to the vanished guest? She thought of the locked attic door, the blood-like stain on the parlour rug, and the gardener's tale of a sob in the maze. The ledger, she suspected, was a key to the deadly truth that haunted the hidden nook. Her musings were interrupted by the creak of the library door. Mrs. Clara Henshaw stood there, a tray of tea in her hands, her smile as polished as ever but tinged with unease. "I thought you might like some tea, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes flickering to the ledger. "Found something interesting?" "Oh, just an old account book," Miss Marple replied, her tone light and disarming. "It's fascinating how much one can learn about a house from its records. This one belonged to Mr. Vale, I presume. He must have been a meticulous man." Mrs. Henshaw set the tray down, her movements precise, but her fingers betraying a slight tremble. "Gideon Vale, yes," she said. "He built the house, you know, long before my time. Those old ledgers are just clutter now." She reached for the book, but Miss Marple closed it gently, resting her hand on the cover. "I find them quite charming," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "They tell such stories, debts, promises, secrets, almost like a diary, don't you think?" Mrs. Henshaw's smile tightened, and she busied herself with the tea. "I wouldn't know," she said. "I'm far too busy with the present to bother with the past." But her glance at the ledger was sharp, and Miss Marple noted the way she lingered as if reluctant to leave it in her hands. At luncheon, the guests gathered in the dining room, their conversation subdued after the previous night's scream. Colonel Reginald Poole complained about the interrupted sleep, though Miss Marple observed that his bluster seemed forced, his eyes darting to Mrs. Henshaw as if gauging her mood. Miss Eleanor Vance, pale and quiet, pushed her food around her plate, her sketchbook closed for once. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, as ever, was a study in silence, but her gaze lingered on the library door, visible through the dining-room's archway. Seeking to draw them out, Miss Marple mentioned the ledger casually. "I found the most interesting book in the library," she said, her voice mild. "An old ledger from Mr. Vale's time. It seems he had quite a few unusual expenses. I wonder what stories this house could tell." Miss Vance's fork clattered against her plate, and she flushed. "Old houses always have secrets," she said, her voice barely audible. "Don't they?" Colonel Poole snorted. "Bills and budgets, that's all. Every house has 'em. No need to make a mystery of it." Mrs. Gray's eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a moment a flicker of understanding passed between them. "Some expenses," she said softly, "are paid to keep things hidden, like a corner no one speaks of." The room fell silent, and Mrs. Henshaw, who had been serving soup, paused, her ladle hovering. "Really, Mrs. Gray," she said, her tone sharp, "you do have a flair for the dramatic. It's just an old ledger, nothing more." But Miss Marple, watching closely, saw the tension in Mrs. Henshaw's shoulders, the way Miss Vance's hands trembled, and the Colonel's forced chuckle. The ledger, she thought, was more than a record of accounts. It was a map to the past, pointing to a scandal, perhaps blackmail, perhaps murder, that had left its mark on the hidden nook. She thought of the scream, the locked attic door, and the maze's shadowed paths. The hidden corner, she suspected, was not just a place, but a secret, and the ledger held its price. That afternoon, as she returned the ledger to its shelf, Miss Marple noticed a faint mark on the inside cover, a tiny sketch of a corner, with an arrow pointing to a rose. It was the same rose pattern she had seen in the wallpaper, and she wondered if the two were connected. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled many such threads, and she felt the tapestry of the hidden nook's mystery growing clearer. As she left the library, she heard a floorboard creak behind her, but when she turned, the corridor was empty. The huge house, she thought, was watching her as closely as she watched it. Chapter 8. The Corner's First Clue Miss. Jane Marple stood in the quiet of the hidden nook's dining room, her eyes tracing the intricate wallpaper that had intrigued her since her arrival. The morning light slanted through the windows, illuminating the ivy and rose patterns that seemed to twist into deliberate shapes. A corner, perhaps, or a doorway hidden in plain sight. After the discovery of the dusty ledger with its cryptic entries, Miss Marple had resolved to explore the house more thoroughly, her instincts sharpened by the scream in the night and the whispers of a vanished woman. In St. Mary Mead, she had often found that secrets were concealed in the most ordinary places, and the hidden nook, she suspected, was no different. The dining room was empty, the guests having dispersed after breakfast. Colonel Reginald Poole to the village pub, Miss Eleanor Vance to sketch in the garden, and Mrs. Lavinia Gray to her room, claiming a headache. Mrs. Clara Henshaw was in the kitchen, her voice carrying faintly as she instructed Lily on the day's tasks. Seizing the moment, Miss Marple set her knitting bag on a chair and approached the fireplace, where the wallpaper's pattern seemed most pronounced. She had noticed a slight irregularity the previous evening, a panel that sat fractionally proud of the wall, its edges masked by the swirling ivy design. With a gentle press, she tested the panel, her fingers probing for a seam. To her surprise, it gave way with a soft click, revealing a narrow compartment no larger than a bread box. Inside, nestled on a faded velvet lining, was a silver locket, its surface tarnished but engraved with the initials E.M. Beside it lay a folded slip of paper yellowed with age. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She glanced over her shoulder, ensuring she was alone, and carefully opened the locket. Within was a faded photograph of a young woman, her face delicate and serious, her eyes holding a hint of apprehension. The note, written in a hurried hand, read, "The corner holds the truth. Trust no one. E.M." The words were stark, their meaning as elusive as the mist that clung to the garden maze. Miss Marple closed the locket and tucked both it and the note into her pocket, her mind racing. Could E.M. be the vanished guest the postmistress had mentioned, the woman tied to the hidden corner? And was this compartment the corner itself, or merely a pointer to a darker secret? She closed the panel, ensuring it clicked back into place, and resumed her seat, her needles clicking as if nothing had occurred. But her thoughts were far from idle. The locket and note were tangible clues, the first concrete evidence of the deadly truth that haunted the hidden nook. She recalled the ledger's cryptic payments to C and L, the blood-like stain on the parlour rug, and the gardener's tale of a sob in the maze. The scream in the night, so close to the locked attic door, suggested someone might have stumbled upon a similar clue, or been silenced for it. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Henshaw, carrying a tray of biscuits for elevenses. The proprietress's smile was as crisp as ever, but her eyes darted to the fireplace, as if sensing a disturbance. "Everything all right, Miss Marple?" she asked, her tone light but probing. "Oh, quite," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. "I was just admiring the fireplace. Such fine craftsmanship. It must be original to the house, don't you think?" Mrs. Henshaw nodded, though her gaze lingered on the wallpaper. "Yes, Mr. Vale spared no expense, though it's a bother to maintain all these old nooks and crannies." Her words were casual, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her jaw, as if the mention of nooks struck a nerve. As Mrs. Henshaw left, Miss Vance entered, her sketchbook under her arm, her face pale. "Miss Marple," she said hesitantly, "have you ever found something you wish you hadn't?" Her eyes flicked to the fireplace, and Miss Marple wondered if the young artist had noticed the same panel, or something else entirely. "Sometimes, dear," Miss Marple said gently, her needles pausing, "but often such discoveries lead to the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Have you found something troubling?" Miss Vance shook her head quickly, her fingers twisting a strand of hair. No, just a feeling. This house, it's so full of shadows." She hurried out, leaving Miss Marple to ponder her words. The locket, she thought, could belong to the vanished E.M., perhaps a victim of the crime hinted at in the ledger. Its discovery in the dining room suggested the hidden corner might be a physical place within the house, though the maze and attic remained possibilities. At luncheon, the guests were subdued. Colonel Poole's anecdotes lacked their usual vigour, and Mrs. Gray's silence was more pronounced, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple as if sensing her discovery. Lily, serving the meal, dropped a spoon, her hands trembling as she retrieved it. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the maids, glanced toward the dining-room's fireplace, as if she knew its secret. That afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in the garden, the locket heavy in her pocket, she felt a prickle of unease. The note's warning, "Trust no one," echoed in her mind, and she wondered if her discovery had been observed. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that uncovering a clue often stirred the one who wished it to remain hidden. As she gazed at the maze, its paths shrouded in the afternoon mist, she resolved to tread carefully. The hidden corner was closer now, its truth within reach, but with it came a shadow of danger that even her keen instincts could not yet fully discern. Chapter 9. The Widow's Confession. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parlour of the hidden nook, where Miss Jane Marple sat with her knitting, her needles moving with their usual steady rhythm. The locket and its cryptic note, safely tucked in her pocket, weighed heavily on her mind. Their discovery, a tangible link to the hidden corner and the vanished woman, E.M. The scream in the night, the blood-like stain, the gardener's tale of the maze, and the ledger's hints of blackmail had woven a complex tapestry, and Miss Marple felt she was on the verge of discerning its pattern. Yet she knew from her years in St. Mary Mead that the most elusive truths often emerge from the quietest voices, and today her attention was fixed on Mrs. Lavinia Gray. The widow sat in her customary corner, her black crepe dress blending into the shadows, her hands folded in her lap like a statue of mourning. Throughout Miss Marple's stay, Mrs. Gray had been a figure of enigmatic silence, her dark eyes observing more than her words revealed. At tea, when the other guests, Colonel Reginald Poole and Miss Eleanor Vance, had excused themselves too. The garden, Mrs. Gray lingered, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity to draw her out. "It's a peaceful house, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as she set her knitting aside. "Though I find old places like this often carry echoes of the past. You mentioned having business here, Mrs. Gray. Something personal, perhaps?" Mrs. Gray's eyes met hers, sharp and searching, as if weighing the risk of candour. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then, in a voice low and deliberate, she spoke. "You see more than most, Miss Marple," she said. "I came to the hidden nook to confront someone tied to an old wrong. I thought I could face it, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her heart quickened. "An old wrong," she repeated softly. "Connected to this house, perhaps. I've heard talk of a hidden corner, a vanished woman. Might that be part of it?" Mrs. Gray's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles white against the black fabric. "You've been listening to the village gossip," she said, but there was no reproach in her tone, only a weary resignation. "There was a woman, yes, Emily. She was dear to me, a cousin, though we were more like sisters. She stayed here 30 years ago, and then she was gone. No trace, no explanation. They said she ran away, but I never believed it." "Emily," Miss Marple said, her mind latching onto the initials E.M. from the locket. "That must have been terribly painful. Do you think something happened to her here? In the hidden corner, perhaps?" Mrs. Gray's gaze flickered to the fireplace where Miss Marple had found the hidden compartment the previous day. "I don't know where it is," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know she found something dangerous. She wrote to me before she vanished, said she'd discovered a secret in this house, something that frightened her, I came to find out what it was and who was responsible. But now—" She trailed off, her eyes shadowed with fear. "Now?" Miss Marple prompted gently, her tone as soothing as a vicar's wife offering tea. Mrs. Gray hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Now, I think someone else knows. That scream last night, it wasn't just a fright. Someone's afraid or someone's warning us. I've seen things, Miss Marple. Shadows moving where they shouldn't, doors opened that ought to stay locked. I'm afraid to say more, but I'm afraid to stay silent too." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Mrs. Gray's confession, though partial, was a vital thread. The locket inscribed with E.M. likely belonged to Emily, her cousin, and the note, "The corner holds the truth. Trust no one," was a warning from a woman who had uncovered a deadly secret. The scream, the locked attic door, the ledger's payments, and the gardener's tale of a sob in the maze all pointed to a crime concealed within the hidden nook. And Mrs. Gray's fear suggested the culprit might still be near. Before Miss Marple could press further, Mrs. Clara Henshaw entered, her apron crisp and her smile firmly in place. "More tea, ladies?" she asked, her eyes darting between them. Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her posture, as if she sensed the weight of their conversation. "No, thank you," Mrs. Gray said abruptly, rising and excusing herself. As she left, her glance at Miss Marple was almost pleading, as if, urging her to continue the search, she could not. Mrs. Henshaw lingered, rearranging the tea tray with unnecessary care. "Mrs. Gray seems out of sorts," she remarked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "I hope she's not troubling you with old stories." "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "She was just sharing a bit about her cousin. It's natural to seek closure, don't you think? Especially in a house with so much history." Mrs. Henshaw's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "History is best left alone," she said, and bustled out, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, the locket in her hand. Mrs. Gray's confession had confirmed her suspicions. Emily, the vanished woman, had uncovered a secret tied to the hidden corner, and it had cost her dearly. The scream suggested someone else had stumbled upon that truth, or was desperate to keep it hidden. She thought of the other guests, Colonel Poole's forced bluster, Miss Vance's nervous sketches, Lily's trembling hands. One of them, or perhaps Mrs. Henshaw herself, might be guarding the secret, or running from it. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that confessions, even partial ones, were like loose threads in a sweater. Pull gently, and the whole pattern unravelled. As she tucked the locket away, she resolved to tug a little harder, though she knew the truth might bring danger as well as answers. The hidden nook, with its locked doors and shadowed corners, was whispering louder now, and she was listening. Chapter 10. Footprints in the Maze. The garden maze of the hidden nook loomed in the early morning mist, its dense yew hedges forming a labyrinth of shadows that seemed to pulse with secrets. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her sensible coat and carrying her knitting bag as a pretext for her wanderings, stood at the maze's entrance, her sharp eyes scanning the gravel path that disappeared into the green. The gardener's tale of a sob in the maze, coupled with Mrs. Gray's confession about her cousin Emily and the locket's cryptic warning, had convinced her that the hidden corner might lie beyond the house's walls. In St. Mary Mead, she had often found that gardens held truths as dark as any attic, and she was determined to explore this one. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of damp earth and fading roses, and the silence was broken only by the distant call of a rook. Miss Marple stepped into the maze, her shoes crunching softly on the gravel, her mind alert to every detail. The paths twisted and turned, the hedges towering overhead, their branches woven so tightly that little light penetrated. She moved with purpose, recalling Mr. Cobb's words about a corner where secrets were buried. The maze, she thought, was the perfect place to conceal a meeting, or a crime. After several turns, she reached a small clearing, a secluded corner where the hedges formed a natural alcove. The ground here was softer, less trodden, and her eyes caught a glimmer of disturbance, fresh footprints clearly defined in the damp soil, leading to and from the alcove. They were of two distinct sizes, one larger, perhaps a man's, and one smaller, possibly a woman's. Kneeling carefully, Miss Marple examined the prints, noting their depth and the way they overlapped, as if two people had stood here recently, perhaps in haste. As she rose, her gaze fell on a small object half buried in the soil, a monogrammed handkerchief, its white linen stained with dirt, but bearing the embroidered initials R.P. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. R.P. could only be Colonel Reginald Poole, whose bluster had seemed increasingly forced in recent days. She tucked the handkerchief into her pocket beside the locket, her mind racing. A clandestine meeting in the maze, so soon after the scream in the night, suggested someone was guarding or seeking the deadly truth. She retraced her steps, memorizing the maze's turns to ensure she could return, and emerged into the garden just as the mist began to lift. The house loomed ahead, its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows serene in the morning light, but Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. The footprints and handkerchief were new threads in the tapestry, linking the maze to the house's secrets. She thought of the ledger's payments to C and L, the blood-like stain, and Mrs. Gray's fear that someone else knew Emily's secret. Could Colonel Poole be involved, or had he stumbled upon something that put him in danger? Back at the house, breakfast was a tense affair. Colonel Poole was late, arriving with mud on his boots and a distracted air, his usual anecdotes replaced by curt responses. Miss Vance, sketching absently, seemed more nervous than ever, her eyes darting to the garden door. Mrs. Gray, as silent as ever, watched the Colonel with an intensity that Miss Marple found telling. Mrs. Henshaw, serving kedgeree, was her usual efficient self, but Miss Marple noted the way her gaze lingered on the Colonel's boots, as if she, too, had seen something amiss. Seeking to test the waters, Miss Marple remarked casually, "I took a turn in the maze this morning. Such an intriguing place, though the paths are a bit muddy. Easy to leave a mark, don't you think?" Colonel Poole's fork paused mid-air, and he coughed, covering it with a laugh. "Muddy? Yes, well, old gardens like that are a mess this time of year. Never go in myself. Too confusing." But his eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush on his neck. Miss Vance's pencil snapped, and she flushed, muttering an apology. Mrs. Gray said nothing, but her fingers tightened around her teacup. Mrs. Henshaw, clearing plates, chimed in brightly. "The maze is best left alone, Miss Marple. It's overgrown, and Mr. Cobb can't keep up with it any more." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. "Oh, I found it quite manageable," she said, "though I did find a handkerchief. Such a shame to lose something so finely monogrammed." She watched the Colonel closely, but it was Mrs. Henshaw who reacted, her tray rattling slightly as she turned away. After breakfast, Miss Marple lingered in the parlour, pretending to read while observing Lily, who was polishing the silver with her usual nervous energy. "Lily, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "have you ever walked in the maze? It's such a curious place, full of corners." Lily's cloth stilled, and her eyes widened. "No, ma'am," she said quickly. "I don't like it. It's spooky. Mr. Cobb says to stay out, and I do." But her glance toward the garden betrayed her, and Miss Marple wondered if the maid had seen or heard something in the maze, perhaps the sob Mr. Cobb had mentioned. As the day wore on, Miss Marple sat in her room, the handkerchief and locket laid out before her. The initials R.P. and E.M. were like bookends to a story she was only beginning to read. The maze, with its footprints and hidden alcove, was a meeting place, perhaps for someone protecting the hidden corner or seeking to uncover it. Colonel Poole's muddy boots and Mrs. Henshaw's unease suggested they knew more than they let on, and Mrs. Gray's confession hinted at a truth that still frightened her. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that footprints led to destinations, and these, she suspected, led to the heart of the hidden Nook's deadly secret. As she tucked the clues away, she heard a faint rustle outside her door, as if someone had paused to listen. The house, she thought, was growing restless, and the hidden corner was no longer content to remain hidden. With a quiet resolve, she decided to watch the Colonel closely, and to return to the maze where the truth might be waiting. Chapter 11. The clock strikes midnight. The grandfather clock in the hall of the hidden Nook stood like a sentinel, its polished mahogany case gleaming in the dim light of the sconces. Miss Jane Marple, descending the stairs for a late cup of tea, paused to admire its steady tick, a sound that had become as familiar as the creak of the floorboards. It was 1:45, and the house was hushed. The guests retired too, their rooms after a day marked by uneasy silences and guarded glances. The footprints in the maze, the monogrammed handkerchief, and Mrs. Gray's confession about her cousin Emily had tightened the threads of the mystery, and Miss Marple felt the hidden corner was closer than ever to revealing its truth. She settled in the parlour, her knitting bag at her side, though her needles remained untouched. The locket with its cryptic note, "The corner holds the truth. Trust no one," and the handkerchief marked R.P. lay heavy in her pocket, each a piece of the puzzle that pointed to a crime buried in the house's past. The scream, the ledger's payments, and the gardener's tale of a sob in the maze all suggested a secret that someone was desperate to keep hidden. As she sipped her tea, her eyes drifted to the hall, where the clock's pendulum swung with metronomic precision. At the stroke of midnight, the clock's chimes began, deep and resonant, filling the house with their sombre toll. But on the 12th strike, the sound faltered, replaced by a jarring silence. Miss Marple set her cup down, her senses alert. The clock had stopped, an event as unnatural in this meticulously maintained house as a heartbeat ceasing. She rose and approached the hall, where she found Mrs. Clara Henshaw already standing before the clock, her face pale and her hands clenched at her sides. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Henshaw said, her voice strained as she turned. "The clock. It's stopped. It hasn't done that in years." Her eyes darted to the clock's face, frozen at midnight, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in her fingers as she reached for the key to wind it. "How curious," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her mind sharp. "A clock stopping at midnight. It's almost poetic, don't you think? In my village, such things were often said to mark a significant moment. A birth, a death, or perhaps a secret." Mrs. Henshaw's smile was tight, almost brittle. "Just a mechanical fault," she said, fumbling. "With the key. Old clocks are temperamental. I'll have Mr. Cobb look at it tomorrow." But her haste betrayed her, and as she opened the clock's case, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. Miss Marple, ever quick to notice, stooped to retrieve it before Mrs. Henshaw could. It was a torn fragment, yellowed with age, bearing a single line in the same spidery hand as the ledger. "Midnight, the corner sealed." She handed it to Mrs. Henshaw, watching closely as the proprietress's face blanched further. "How interesting," Miss Marple said. "It seems this clock has stories to tell." Mrs. Henshaw tucked the paper into her apron, her movements jerky. "Just old rubbish," she said, forcing a laugh. "This house is full of odd bits and pieces." But her eyes avoided Miss Marple's, and she hurried to wind the clock, the tick resuming with a reluctant groan. The incident drew the attention of the other guests who appeared in the hall, roused by the chimes or the sudden silence. Colonel Reginald Poole, in a dressing gown, grumbled about the disturbance, though Miss Marple noted the mud still clinging to his boots, as if he'd been out in the maze again. Miss Eleanor Vance, clutching her shawl, looked more frightened than ever, her eyes darting to the clock as if it were a portent. Mrs. Lavinia Gray stood at the back, her expression unreadable, but her gaze fixed on Mrs. Henshaw, as if sensing her unease. "It's nothing," Mrs. Henshaw said, addressing the group with forced cheer. "Just a clock needing a wind. Back to bed, everyone." But her voice trembled, and Miss Marple saw Lily, hovering in the doorway, flinch at the mention of midnight. Seeking to probe further, Miss Marple turned to the group. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a story about a clock that stopped at midnight, the very hour a tragedy occurred. Have you heard anything like that about the hidden Nook? Perhaps tied to the hidden corner?" Colonel Poole snorted. "Clocks and ghost stories! Poppycock! I was asleep until this racket woke me." But his hand brushed his pocket where Miss Marple suspected another handkerchief might lie. Miss Vance's voice was barely audible. I heard something about a woman disappearing at midnight," she said, then clamped her mouth shut as if regretting her words. Mrs. Gray's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, her silence louder than any response. Mrs. Henshaw ushered them back to their rooms, but Miss Marple lingered, her mind turning over the fragment's words. Midnight, the corner sealed. She thought of the locket's warning, the ledger's payments, and the footprints in the maze. The clock stopping at midnight, coupled with Mrs. Henshaw's reaction, suggested a moment frozen in time, a moment when the deadly truth was born. Was it the hour Emily vanished, her fate sealed in the hidden corner? And why did Mrs. Henshaw seem so shaken by a mere mechanical fault? As she returned to her room, Miss Marple paused by the locked attic door, its bolt gleaming in the moonlight. The clock, the maze, the locket, the stain, all were threads in a tapestry, and midnight was the knot that tied them together. In St. Mary Mead she had unravelled many such knots, but this one, she sensed, was guarded by someone who would not hesitate to protect it. She resolved to watch Mrs. Henshaw closely, and to listen for what the house whispered in the hours after. Midnight. As she closed her door, a faint creak echoed from the corridor, as if the house itself were stirring. The hidden nook, she thought, was growing impatient, and the deadly truth was no longer content to remain in the shadows. Chapter 12. The Hidden Nook Revealed. The hidden nook was cloaked in the stillness of early evening, its corridors dim, and its shadows long, as Miss Jane Marple stood before the fireplace in the dining-room, her fingers tracing the ivy-patterned wallpaper that had intrigued her since her arrival, the locket with its cryptic note, the monogrammed handkerchief, the stopped clock, and Mrs. Gray's confession about her cousin Emily had woven a tapestry of clues, each pointing to the elusive hidden corner. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that secrets often hid behind the most ordinary facades, and tonight she was determined to uncover the truth that the hidden nook had guarded for decades. The house was quiet, the guests occupied with their own thoughts. Colonel Reginald Poole in the parlour with a brandy, Miss Eleanor Vance sketching in her room, and Mrs. Lavinia Gray, retired early, claiming fatigue. Mrs. Clara Henshaw was in the kitchen, her voice faintly audible as she directed Lily on the evening's chores. Miss Marple, seizing the rare moment of solitude, returned to the dining-room where she had found the hidden compartment containing the locket. The wallpaper's pattern, with its twisting vines and roses, had hinted at a corner or doorway, and the ledger's cryptic entries about the corner had convinced her that the answer lay here. She pressed the panel she had discovered days ago, her fingers searching for the seam she knew was there. The click was faint but unmistakable, and the panel swung inward, revealing not the small compartment, but a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person to slip through. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She glanced over her shoulder, ensuring she was alone, and stepped into the passage, her small flashlight casting a thin beam into the darkness. The air was musty, heavy with the scent of damp wood and thyme. The passage led to a small room. No, larger than a closet, its walls bare except for a single shelf. On it lay a leather-bound diary, its pages brittle with age, and a bundle of faded letters tied with a ribbon. Dust coated the floor, undisturbed except for a faint scuff mark near the shelf, as if someone had been here recently. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unravelling village mysteries, told her this was the hidden corner she had been seeking. She opened the diary, its pages filled with the same spidery hand as the ledger and the clock's note. The entries, dated 30 years ago, told a chilling story. They spoke of a young woman, Emily Morton, who had come to the hidden nook as a guest. She had discovered a secret, details of a blackmail scheme involving Gideon Vale, the house's original owner, and a partner referred to only as C. Emily had threatened to expose them, and the final entry, dated the night of her disappearance, read, "Midnight, the corner sealed, EM is silenced, the truth is safe." Miss Marple's breath caught. The locket's initials, EM, matched Emily Morton, Mrs. Gray's cousin. The ledger's payments to C and the note in the clock, "Midnight, the corner sealed," pointed to a murder concealed in this very room. The blood-like stain in the parlour, the scream in the night, the footprints in the maze, all suggested that someone in the house knew of this crime and was desperate to keep it hidden. The diary, she realized, was the key to the deadly truth, but its discovery placed her in grave danger. As she tucked the diary into her knitting bag, a faint creak echoed from the passage. She extinguished her flashlight and pressed herself against the wall, her heart steady despite the peril. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, and a shadow loomed in the doorway. It was Mrs. Henshaw, her face pale in the dim light, a heavy candlestick in her hand. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and edged with menace, "you've been poking about where you shouldn't." Miss Marple's tone was calm, her eyes twinkling despite the threat. "I was just admiring the house's history, Mrs. Henshaw," she said. "It's remarkable what one finds in old corners. This room, for instance, it seems to hold quite a story." Mrs. Henshaw's grip on the candlestick tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might strike. But the proprietress's face crumpled, and she lowered the candlestick, her voice trembling. "You don't understand," she said. "Some things are better left alone, for everyone's sake." Before Miss Marple could respond, a second figure appeared. Colonel Poole, his face flushed and his eyes darting between them. "What's this?" he demanded, his voice gruff. "Mrs. Henshaw, what's going on?" Mrs. Henshaw recoiled, and Miss Marple seized the moment. "Just a little exploration, Colonel," she said, stepping into the passage. "But I think it's time we all had a talk. There are secrets in this house that can't stay hidden any longer." As they returned to the dining room, Miss Marple felt the weight of the diary in her bag and the eyes of Mrs. Henshaw and the Colonel on her. The scream, the footprints, the locket, the ledger, all pointed to a murder committed 30 years ago, its truth sealed in the hidden corner. But the fresh scuff mark in the secret room and Mrs. Henshaw's reaction suggested the killer, or someone protecting them, was still in the hidden nook. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had faced danger before, but this time she knew the truth was a step away, and with it came a shadow that might strike to keep it buried. She resolved to gather the guests that evening to lay out the clues and see who flinched. The hidden nook, she thought, was ready to reveal its heart, and she would be there to listen when it did. Chapter 13. The truth in the corner, the parlour of the hidden nook, was bathed in the flickering glow of the fire, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill that settled over the gathered guests and staff. Miss Jane Marple stood near the fireplace, her knitting bag at her feet, her serene demeanour belying the gravity of the moment. The clues she had uncovered, the locked attic door, the blood-like stain, the gardener's tale, the scream, the dusty ledger, the locket, Mrs. Gray's confession, the footprints in the maze, the stopped clock, and the diary from the secret room had woven a tapestry of a crime committed 30 years ago. Tonight she would unravel it, revealing the deadly truth that had haunted the hidden nook and unmasking the killer among them. The guests sat in tense silence. Colonel Reginald Poole, his moustache twitching with unease. Miss Eleanor Vance, her hands clutching her sketchbook. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, her dark eyes fixed on Miss Marple with a mix of hope and dread. And Mrs. Clara Henshaw, her smile absent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Lily, the maid, hovered near the door, her face pale and her eyes darting nervously. The grandfather clock, now ticking again, marked the hour with a sombre chime, as if signalling the moment of revelation. "I've gathered you here," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but firm, "because the hidden Nook has kept a secret for too long. A secret tied to the hidden corner and a young woman named Emily Morton, who vanished 30 years ago. Her disappearance was no accident, but a murder, concealed in this house and guarded by someone among us." A gasp escaped Miss Vance, and Colonel Poole shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Henshaw's lips parted, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor. Mrs. Gray leaned forward, her hands trembling. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. "It began with the wallpaper, whose patterns hinted at a hidden door. Then the locked attic door, which Mrs. Henshaw dismissed as storage, but its new bolt suggested otherwise. The stain on the parlour rug, like blood, hinted at violence. Mr. Cobb's tale of a sob in the maze pointed to a secret beyond the house. The scream in the night suggested someone had uncovered, or was silencing, a truth. The ledger in the Agatha library revealed payments for silence, and the locket inscribed EM, with its note, "The corner holds the truth. Trust no one," confirmed Emily's fate. The footprints in the maze, with Colonel Poole's handkerchief, and the stopped clock at midnight, with its note, "Midnight, the corner sealed," all led to the secret room behind the dining-room wall, where I found a diary detailing Emily's murder. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. Emily Morton, Mrs. Gray's cousin, discovered a blackmail scheme run by Gideon Vale, the house's original owner, and a partner known as C. She threatened to expose them, and on the night she vanished at midnight, she was killed in the secret room, the hidden corner, and her body hidden, perhaps in the maze where Mr. Cobb heard a sob and found a spade with fresh dirt. Colonel Poole interrupted, his voice gruff. "This is preposterous. I wasn't even here 30 years ago. I'm just a guest." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, Colonel. But your handkerchief in the maze, your muddy boots and your unease suggest you've been searching for something, or covering it up. The initials RP match yours, but they also matched Robert Poole, your father, who was here 30 years ago, wasn't he? A man with a temper known to Mr. Vale." The Colonel's face reddened. "My father died years ago. He had nothing to do with this." "But you knew," Miss Marple said softly. "You came to protect his name, didn't you? You found that the maze met someone there, perhaps to ensure the secret stayed buried." Her gaze shifted to Mrs. Henshaw, whose hands were now clenched into fists. "But the true culprit is closer to home. Mrs. Henshaw, your reaction to the stopped clock, your fear when I found the ledger, and your presence in the secret room with a candlestick, all point to you. The ledger's payments to C were to Clara, your aunt, who ran the hidden Nook before you. She was Gideon Vale's partner in the blackmail scheme. When Emily threatened to expose them, your aunt killed her, hiding her body in the secret room before moving it to the maze. You inherited the house. And the secret. Mrs. Henshaw's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't kill her, she cried. My aunt did, yes, but I was just a girl. When I took over, I found the diary, the locket. I tried to keep it hidden to protect the house. The scream was Lily. She saw me checking the secret room, panicked and ran. I didn't want anyone hurt, Lily whimpered, and Miss Vance burst into tears, confessing she'd sketched the maze's corner, sensing its darkness. Mrs. Gray rose, her voice steady. You've given me peace, Miss Marple. I knew Emily was wronged, but now she can rest. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but resolute. The truth, Mrs. Henshaw, cannot stay hidden. You didn't kill Emily, but you guarded her killers. Secret, and that's a burden you must now face. As the village constable was called, the guests dispersed, their faces a mix of relief and shock. The hidden nook, its hidden corner revealed, seemed to breathe easier, its shadows lighter. Miss Marple packed her knitting bag, her work done. In St. Mary Mead she had unravelled many such secrets, but the hidden nook's truth had been a dark one, sealed at midnight and buried in a corner that could no longer hold it. As she stepped into the waiting cab, she glanced back at the house, now at peace, and smiled faintly. St. Mary's Hollow, like her own village, would heal, and the deadly truth was a secret no more.